Hi, and welcome. I'm Terry Kahn, PA 65, class secretary. That's 1965, by the way. You're going to learn about 1865 and other years in a moment. I'm here today with John Patrick, another 65er. And John's going to share with us everything he's learned about Andover's first 100 years, the key people, the key events, basically how the school took form. Now, John's been working on this for over a year. It began as a guided walking tour of the Andover campus, which was going to be a focal point of our 55th reunion last June. That didn't happen for obvious reasons. So John has taken that material and he's turned it into a series of online presentations, virtual tours if you want. On March 2nd, he's going to talk about the 50 years after the first 100 and how what was then a Victorian academy transformed itself into what was, for the mid 20th century, a state-of-the-art school, and a school that many of us really know about. It's a fascinating journey that he's taking us on, and he'll finish it next summer with our virtual reunion being the focal point of a guided architectural history tour, which was essentially what he began to do. When we finish here, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. You can actually pose those questions on the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screen. And we'll take as many as we can to fit in the time. But with all that, and with a great deal of gratitude, because for so many of us, not being able to get on campus for the past year plus has been an incredible frustration. So John's going to give us a chance to experience the school, experience its history, and experience the campus once again. And I, for one, am very, very grateful. And with that, John, it's all yours.
Thanks, Terry, and thank you all for joining us today. I should note from the outset that this talk will not include Abbott Academy. It's simply impossible to cover the history of Phillips Academy and do justice to Abbott at the same time. Abbott's history differs from PA's almost as much as PA's differs from Exeter's. Jumping back and forth between the two would only cause confusion. Abbott's rich history really requires and deserves a talk of its own. This tree, which stands between the Oliver, whoops, I didn't get the tree up, there we go. This tree, which stands between the Oliver Wendell Holmes Library and Salem Street, is called the Great Elm or Centennial Elm. It's believed to date from between 1720 and 1740, before Samuel Phillips was even born. Personally, I find it humbling and yet somehow reassuring that long and distinguished as the history of Phillips Academy undoubtedly is, the Great Elm has been alive half a century longer, and like our school, it continues to flourish. PA story actually began miles away in this little red schoolhouse carefully preserved at the Governor's Academy in Byfield, Massachusetts. It was here that Samuel Phillips, our founder, and Lafayette Pearson, our first leader, met as schoolmates in 1763, when what was then called the Dummer Charity School first opened. Then as now, the school's motto was non sibi sed aliis, not for oneself, but for others. This is obviously where Samuel Phillips came up with PA's motto. So how similar was this school to the one our two schoolmates would later establish? The Dummer School's beloved first teacher, Master Samuel Moody, ran a school that very much reflected the 18th century Enlightenment. He largely ignored New England's Puritan Christianity. He admitted any qualified student, regardless of origin. He taught not just the standard Latin and Greek required for admission to college, but also less traditional subjects such as French. He even taught dancing and gave swimming lessons in the nearby Parker River. Rather than rule by the rod, as was then customary, he relied primarily on patient encouragement and the force of his own kindly personality. Jean-Jacques Rousseau would have found much to admire here. The periwigged Samuel Phillips in this portrait looked very much like a man of the Enlightenment, except perhaps for the somber clothing. But he was no Enlightenment skeptic, no free-thinking philosopher like Thomas Jefferson. On the contrary, he condemned the irreligion and moral laxity he saw increasing all around him. We have an undated manuscript in his handwriting, apparently written sometime around 1775, in which he set down his early thoughts on what his school should be like. In that document, he called it injudicious, unnatural, and absurd to teach schoolboys Latin and Greek. It should be noted, however, that as late as the 1820s, boys still routinely went on to college as young as 14 or 15. Phillips expressed no objection to introducing them to Latin and Greek in their first years of college, when they would still be completing what we would consider the last part of their secondary education. What Phillips did apparently object to was exposing boys to ancient authors steeped in what he called, quote, the foolish and stupid religion of their times, unquote, before first inoculating them with the 16th century faith of John Calvin. The school he had in mind would teach youths in the beginning the Calvinist faith and morals that would enable them to resist, in the end, the false allures of 18th century rationalism. Or, as our school motto puts it, finis origine pendet. In particular, the school would teach them the harsh Calvinist doctrine of natural depravity, which taught that no human being could ever behave well enough to deserve salvation. In dropping the words sed aliis from the Dummer School motto, he presumably meant that his school would not teach its charges to serve others per se, but rather to humbly serve an all-powerful, all-knowing God, whose mercy they might perhaps receive, but could never deserve. Scion of wealthy merchants and eminent Puritan divines, Phillips also condemned what he called collections from every quarter, in other words, what he had found at the Dummer School. His school would educate youths of his own class, the sons of New England's elite. This portrait of La Follette Pearson, although painted much later, leaves no doubt why Phillips chose his old schoolmate and Harvard classmate to run his school. A brilliant scholar and a big man of iron conviction, Pearson very much believed in ruling by the rod, as well as in upholding the highest intellectual and moral standards by identifying error and rooting it out. Pearson disagreed, however, with some of Phillips's original ideas. It was most likely he who convinced Phillips that it was safe to make the new school a traditional classic academy, teaching only Latin, Greek, and a bit of math, a curriculum that would persist at PA for the next 100 years. It may also have been Pearson, a farmer's son, who convinced Phillips to stipulate that the school, quote, shall be ever equally open to youth of requisite qualifications from every quarter, unquote. It would have been logical for Pearson to remind his wealthy friend that the soul of a scholarship boy is just as worth saving as that of a rich man's son. And it probably didn't hurt that both young men, still in their 20s at the time, were ardent patriots in the American Revolution, which claimed as self-evident the idea that all men are created equal. In any case, Phillips Academy would strive from the outset to help qualified students otherwise unable to afford an education. Last Wednesday, my very patient and forbearing collaborator, Dick Howe, class of '64, stood among heaps of snow where the vista crosses Main Street and took this picture of the Archaeology Institute on the far side of Phillips Street. Someone standing in roughly the same place on April 30th, 1778, when Phillips Academy opened, would have seen something like this artist's impression, which probably dates from the late 19th or early 20th century. This is only an educated guess, of course. We know little about how the first academy building appeared, only that it stood on the north corner of Phillips and Main, had previously been a carpenter's shop, or perhaps a joiner's shop, and was just a bit larger than the original Dummer School. The building to the left, farther down Phillips Street, is the farmhouse known as Abbott House, where Samuel Phillips was living when the school opened. It was there that he had written out the generous deed of gift that we know as Phillips Academy's Constitution. And it was there on April 21st, 1778, that the Constitution had been signed by his father, Squire Samuel Phillips, and his uncle, Dr. John Phillips, who had found Exeter 3 years later. The house was torn down in 1889, but a small historic marker now indicates where it stood. 13 students were present for the opening of this makeshift schoolhouse. They ranged in age from 6 to 30 and in academic skill from rudimentary to almost ready to go on to Harvard College. It was not long before 30 students were crowding into this little building. As in any school of that era, students enrolled and departed at will, so the number could fluctuate greatly during the year. Pearson was not only the school's first preceptor or principal, but also its only teacher for the first few years. Classes ran 8 hours a day with a 1-hour break for lunch, 6 days a week, year-round. There were initially 2 terms separated by a 3-week break, but 3 terms would be more typical over the next 100 years. All students remained together in the same classroom, whether studying, receiving instruction, or undergoing the daily oral recitations, during which they recited their lessons verbatim and the instructor corrected their mistakes. There were no written tests. Oral recitation would remain the Academy's only basis for evaluating student performance for nearly 100 years. There were also no grade levels. Students simply stuck with the same textbook for however long it took to master it before going on to the next textbook. Pearson did divide the students into 2 broad categories that he labeled juniors and seniors, but it did little to diminish the workload of providing oral instruction to such a varied student body. PA principals would continue to shoulder a crushing workload for the next 100 years. A first-rate intellectual like Pearson found the endless petty demands of the job extremely irksome. Mild-mannered or less driven principals would find them at best wearying, often overwhelming, and at worst, injurious to their health. The principals who lasted in the job shared Pearson's authoritative temperament, his drive, and his administrative capability, but not his superior intellect. They were competent and diligent, but never brilliant. A rapid increase in enrollment to 60 students made a larger facility imperative. In 1786, just as Pearson left to teach Hebrew at Harvard, a second academy building was completed on what is now the southwest corner of the Great Lawn, near where Salem Street meets Main Street. In this photo, you can see the place where it stood on the right side of Main Street, beyond the bell tower. This artist's impression, probably also from the late 19th or early 20th century, shows what someone might have seen from roughly the same viewpoint in 1790. The second academy building is on the right. To the left, diagonally across Main Street, is Samuel Phillips' splendid new residence known as Mansion House, which stood at the north end of what is now an open lawn in front of the West Quad. In the distance at the corner of Phillips Street is the original Academy building, which would soon be removed. To its left is Abbott House, by this point serving as the principal's residence, although it's doubtful it would actually have been visible from this vantage point. We know what the second Academy building looked like because of this builder's plan, which, although very sparse by today's standard for building a major building like this, told an experienced 18th century housewright all he needed to know, namely the desired dimensions, the exterior appearance, the interior layout, and the style and type of truss work needed to carry the desired roof over the open second floor. The front door on the left opened to a vestibule with a staircase leading to the second floor. A corridor led from the vestibule to the main classroom with a small room on either side. The two small rooms presumably served as what we would call breakout rooms. The open second floor accommodated large events like student exhibitions. The basic layout of this building's interior would appear again in the next two buildings associated with Phillips Academy. We know that the small iron stove in the center of the main classroom could barely heat even that space, let alone the two smaller rooms or the huge room on the second floor. The main classroom had separate daises for the principal and his assistant. PA principals would do more than their share of the teaching throughout the first 100 years. One or more assistants were the only other faculty, and they were of limited help. Only young and inexperienced men would accept an assistant's meager pay, and few stayed more than a year in the job when it gave them no independent authority and no career prospects. The assistants, as well as the principal, made liberal use of corporal punishment, not only to punish infractions, but also as a teaching tool. For example, to impress upon a student the egregiousness of some mistake during an oral recitation. This portion of the Schumann Admission Center, which is located in Wolf Hall, was built in 1804 as PA's first dormitory. Since the founding, all out of town students had lodged with local families approved by the trustees, and no doubt they were all devout Puritan Congregationalists. Some students could not readily afford the price of lodging, however, so the Academy erected this building to lodge 6 of them at less cost. But before any student could move in, the trustees converted it into a residence for Eliphalet Pearson, who was returning to Andover because Harvard, where he was serving as interim president at the time, had appointed someone other than a Calvinist to teach theology. In fact, Harvard would soon reject almost every tenet of Orthodox Christianity and embrace Unitarianism, making it totally unsuitable for training traditional Old Light congregational ministers. So in 1807, the trustees of Phillips Academy, led by Pearson, founded Andover Theological Seminary. In other words, a secondary school founded not just America's first seminary, but its first freestanding graduate school of any kind. The seminary would rapidly become a nationally renowned academic powerhouse in an era when religion played a far greater role in the life of the nation than it does today. Many of the seminary's professors were nationally famous, and the printing company associated with it was the first American firm to print in the Hebrew alphabet. With contributions flowing in, the seminary was able to build a first-rate physical plant centered on these 3 brick buildings. It shouldn't be hard for any PA graduate to identify the location of this classic New England seminary row, if only because portions of the bollards and iron chains surrounding it in this picture can still be seen in front of Foxcroft and Bartlett Halls. The building on the left is, of course, Foxcroft, completed in 1810. It was originally named Phillips Hall because it was donated by Samuel Phillips's son John and his widow Phoebe Foxcroft Phillips, who exhausted the last of their family fortune to build it. In the center is Pearson Hall, completed in 1818. Pearson was moved out from between Foxcroft and Bartlett in the early 1920s to open up the vista. And Samuel Phillips Hall was built behind the old Seminary Row to serve as the vista's focal point. Pearson Hall was designed by the great Federal period architect Charles Bulfinch, arguably the first American architect with a truly national reputation. Originally called Bartlett Chapel, it housed the seminary's large chapel, as well as its library and 3 classrooms. The dormitory on the right, completed in 1821, was and still is called Bartlett Hall, after the Newburyport merchant who funded both it and the Bulfinch designed chapel and classroom building. Note that Foxcroft and Bartlett both had their 4th floor removed in the 1930s, primarily to make their height more consistent with that of the new buildings that had sprung up around them. So much for historic preservation. From its founding, the seminary utterly eclipsed the academy, which would struggle in its shadow throughout most of the 19th century. During that period, the minutes of trustee meetings would often include the brief notation, "No academy business conducted." This beautiful old print in the Addison collection shows the Seminary Row as it appeared sometime after 1833. The size of the trees suggests a date closer to 1850. To the right is the Elm Arch, which still runs across the front of the main campus, and beyond it is the Great Lawn. In the distance, just to the left of the Elm Arch, is what appears to be the Centennial Elm, which even back then would have been at least a century old. The seminary now owned everything on this side of Salem Street, which in this view lies just beyond the Centennial Elm. It also owned a long row of faculty residences over on the west side of Main Street, one of which now houses the head of school. The wooden academy building that had stood on the southwest corner of the Great Lawn burned down in 1818, and the trustees scraped together enough money to build a more spacious brick replacement, which appears in the distance in this image on the far side of Salem Street. Long known simply as the Brick Academy, it now houses the English department. It has been called Bulfinch Hall since the early 20th century because it was also believed to be the work of Charles Bulfinch. However, in the 1990s, a researcher working on the Addison Gallery's excellent architectural history entitled Andover Hill found in the trustee ledger a payment of $15 to Asher Benjamin for, quote, plan of the CAD, unquote. Although not as famous as Bulfinch, Benjamin was certainly one of the most prominent architects of the Federal period, and his work admired. This is what is called a donor portrait, and the subject is Lieutenant Governor William Phillips, a cousin of Samuel's, who contributed more than a third of the money to build the Brick Academy. The Addison Gallery attributes this painting to Gilbert Stuart, the early Republic's most famous painter. Anyone who doubts Stuart's fame can haul out a $1 bill and see one of his many portraits of George Washington. A different Stuart Washington, by the way, hangs in George Washington Hall. The building in the background of the portrait is Bulfinch Hall. What other school can say that one of its iconic buildings appears in a Gilbert Stuart painting? But the painting isn't signed. So why do we think it's by Stuart any more than Bulfinch Hall was by Bulfinch? Phillips also contributed to build the original building of Massachusetts General Hospital. And this is the signed Stuart donor portrait that the hospital commissioned. The one we commissioned is obviously a copy. But if we hired a random copyist, how would he have gotten access to Mass General's painting after Phillips died? And why wouldn't we just have commissioned Stuart himself to make the copy? He was perennially short of money and famous for making many copies of his own works whenever it might bring in a bit of cash. He would sometimes paint just the face on a copy of a portrait and leave the rest to assistants. Addison Gallery Assistant Curator Gordon Wilkins told me that a conservator's report in the 1970s noted overpainting consistent with that approach. He also said that X-ray analysis might further confirm what is already a solid attribution to Stewart. But of course, the Addison has more urgent uses for its limited funding. I mentioned that the Brick Academy had the same basic floor plan as the preceding Wooden Academy. Consequently, what seems to be a side door on the short side nearest to us was really the main door, and the one on the long front of the building was there primarily to create a pleasing main facade. Even though the arrangement of the interior has since been altered repeatedly, the door on the short side, which once faced the Theology Seminary across Salem Street, still gets more use because it now faces PA's main campus. This is a portrait of Squire Samuel Farrar, the leading light in the next period of PA's history, and probably the last person closely associated with the Academy to be called Squire. Treasurer of the Board of Trustees from 1803 to 1840, and its dominant power after 1814, Farrar was cautious, methodical, conservative, and above all, tight-fisted. Yet he was also fond of innovation. He was a primary mover in establishing Abbott Academy, for example, and it was he who laid out the Elm Arch. When Lieutenant Governor Phillips died in 1827, he bequeathed Phillips Academy another $15,000, which the trustees, led by Farrar, applied in part to found yet another new institution on Andover Hill. The trustees called it the Teachers Seminary. To house it, they built a stone structure on the northern edge of the Theology Seminary's campus. This photograph, taken last fall, shows the north side of the street now called Chapel Avenue, with Cochran Chapel in front and the Andover Inn behind it. In the foreground is a commemorative marker identifying the site where the Teachers Seminary stood. This print is a view of Chapel Avenue and the Seminary Row from Main Street between 1830 and 1842. The Teachers Seminary is the austere stone building in front, which quickly became known as the Stone Academy to distinguish it from the earlier Brick Academy. The Stone Academy almost certainly had the same interior layout, but because the Teachers Seminary provided the first science instruction on Andover Hill, it also had a chemistry lab in the basement. The structure behind the Stone Academy is Samaritan House, built in 1817 as an infirmary for the seminary, and by extension, the academy. It was moved in 1929 to make way for Cochran Chapel. The gambrel roof stone building beyond was built as a large woodworking shop, where the theologues, as the seminarians were called, could take a break from their studies and earn a bit of money making wooden items such as coffins. This seemingly practical innovation presumably appealed to Squire Farrar more than it did to the theologues, because it was soon abandoned. Harriet Beecher Stowe arrived in Andover in 1852, the year in which she published Uncle Tom's Cabin, when her husband Calvin became a professor at the seminary. She liked this building so much that she had it converted into their residence. It was moved on to Bartlett Street in the 1930s to make way for the Andover Inn, and is now called Stowe House. Harriet and Calvin Stowe are actually buried in the Academy Cemetery. This old salt print photo from the Addison Gallery is a more accurate image of the Stone Academy. The trustees' stated purpose for the Teachers Seminary was to improve the training of teachers for the common schools, i.e., for public primary schools. However, the trustees muddied the waters by also referring to the new institution as an English school or an English high school. Boston had founded its famous English high school in 1820 to prepare boys not bound for college to run businesses or to supervise work in fields like construction or the installation of industrial machinery or even agriculture, all of which were being transformed by the technology of the Industrial Revolution. The new institution's strikingly progressive teacher training curriculum initially attracted twice as many students as Phillips Academy itself. But enrollment plummeted when the educational reformer hired as principal quit in the face of Samuel Farrar's hard-nosed demand that he run the Teachers Seminary like a proprietary school, wringing enough money out of his students to cover all running costs, including his own salary. Farrar tried to impose those same conditions on Phillips Academy, but the Academy's principal successfully appealed to the trustees over his head. Lacking that kind of clout, the Teachers Seminary struggled to attract students and make ends meet. Nevertheless, the scientific and technical instruction it introduced in its role as a high school prompted a second surge of interest around the time Frederick Law Olmsted enrolled for 1 year in 1837. Olmsted would go on to become America's most famous landscape architect. But the Teachers Seminary could not maintain a consistent level of technical training with unreliable revenue and instructors desperate to teach any subject that might attract paying customers. In 1842, with enrollment again falling, Phillips Academy absorbed the Teachers Seminary, which then became its English department. The English department retained its own principal, but he reported to the principal of Phillips Academy, who also headed the classical department. The PA principal was not interested in English studies and seems to have let the English department muddle along as best it could. Students in the classical department looked down their noses at the English boys. Since PA's founding, the school had tightly controlled students' lives, not just in the classroom, but also in boarding houses, where pious owners enforced school rules that mandated everything from morning and evening prayers to rigid all-day observance of the Sabbath. By this time, however, the classical department was becoming somewhat more like we might recognize as a college preparatory school. Students were increasingly in their mid to late teens because colleges were ceasing to accept applicants as young as 14. The classical department adopted a standard 3-year course of study that divided students into juniors, middlers, and seniors. You can see the origin of PA's nomenclature for grade levels. The English department, unfortunately, would not be in a position to follow suit for some time. Corporal punishment was also falling off, although the principals and their assistants substituted browbeating and shaming for physical abuse. In 1830, the trustees even voted to let students who obtained their principal's permission routinely study in their own rooms, attending class only to receive instruction or to recite. The $15,000 bequest from Lieutenant Governor Phillips also funded another tight-fisted Farrar initiative. This one gave the Teachers Seminary 6 dormitories for students who needed less expensive lodging. It also gave Phillips Academy its first dormitories, 6 identical buildings, also for students of limited means. The dorms for the Teachers Seminary were built in back of Clement House, along a new lane running west from School Street that later became part of Old Campus Road. Clement House still stands on the west side of School Street, a short block down from where it leaves Main Street. This photo shows Old Campus Road where it meets School Street, with Clement House on the opposite corner. Oops, I skipped. Oh well. I think I've inadvertently deleted a slide here because Dick was kind enough to take a picture closer to the dormitory you see up Old Campus Road. You can also, of course, see the smokestack of the power plant in the background. This dorm, which was called Draper Cottage until administrators recently abolished the historic cottage designation in pursuit of some putative efficiency, is, as I just said, very close to the power plant, way over on the west side of campus. Anyone standing on Old Campus Drive after 1836 would have seen what was designated the English Commons, because neither the Trustees Seminary nor the subsequent English department taught Latin or Greek. Draper Cottage was later built exactly where we see the second of these two buildings. The English Commons resembled nothing so much as the cheap housing then springing up in mill towns across New England, and that was probably not coincidental. Each building contained 6 small suites accommodating 2 students. Each suite had a small sitting room heated by an iron stove and 2 tiny bedrooms. A single well with a pump served the entire row, as did a single outhouse with several stalls. Never improved, these dorms would nevertheless continue to serve the English department for the rest of the century. The dorms that were built for Phillips Academy and later served its classical department were lined up along the north side of Phillips Street, starting not very far west of where the Archaeology Institute is now. Dick took this picture of their former location while standing on the right side of Phillips Street, roughly 100 feet beyond the Archaeology building and facing west. Whoops, that was the other picture I was going to show you because it's taken from almost exactly the same position as the shot of the English Commons that I showed you before. This, however, is what we would have seen standing on Phillips Street. This is the Latin Commons. Basically, this is what you would have seen from 1836 on, called the Latin Commons because it was built where Phillips Academy was, when Phillips Academy was still dedicated exclusively to the classics. These dorms would serve PA's classical department throughout the 19th century. As the century progressed, both commons rows increasingly struck visitors as primitive, even unsanitary, but the boys seemed to love them. This was no doubt due to the extraordinary freedom they enjoyed there. The watchword in the commons was laissez-faire. Students did their own housework or neglected it as they saw fit. They fetched their own water and tended their own fires. It was a wonder that only 2 or 3 commons buildings eventually burned down. Faculty supervision initially consisted only of an inspection at a set hour on Saturday, mainly to record property damage, of which there was a considerable amount, and levy fines. It never amounted to much more. Punishment of infractions in the commons depended first on the principal's finding out about them, and then on his ability to discover the culprits. Principals got very good at this, but they could only do so much. The academy boys frequently got up to the sort of mischief one would expect. On one occasion, for example, boys from the Latin Commons plugged up chimneys in the rival English Commons, whose inmates retaliated by dumping salt in the Latin boys' well. Students in the Commons even became responsible for feeding themselves. When the Academy's half-hearted attempt to operate dining rooms in places like Clement House fell through, groups of students pooled their meager funds to pay the owners of nearby houses to purchase food and serve basic meals. These private eating clubs were also somewhat confusingly called commons. Wealthier students made similar arrangements if they didn't eat in the boarding houses where they lived, and the food they obtained was undoubtedly much better than that of the commons boys. This is Samuel Taylor, the last old light Congregationalist to lead Phillips Academy. Known to his students as Uncle Sam, he became principal in 1838. In 1842, when PA absorbed the Teachers Seminary, he moved the classical department out of the Brick Academy and into the Stone Academy along with the English department. To accommodate the additional students, the large hall on the second floor of the Stone Academy seems to have been divided into a number of cramped, ill-ventilated classrooms. The Brick Academy was left vacant only a little more than 2 decades after its completion, used only for the few school events big enough to require its capacious second-floor hall. By now, it had become customary for most graduates of the classical department to go on to Yale, where Puritan religion still held sway, and where Uncle Sam's recommendation alone sufficed to gain admission. In 1864, the Stone Academy burned down, and PA replaced it with a much larger Victorian building, which opened the following year. Samaritan House, shown here, now stands at roughly the same point along School Street where that building once stood, close to the intersection with Main Street. However, the Victorian building was located farther from the street, with its front steps, I'd say roughly where the back extension of the Seminary House is now. This is by no means the only 19th century PA photo showing students in places that would make the hair of today's teachers and administrators stand on end. The new classroom they're posing in, on, and around is ugly even to someone like me, who has a soft spot for high Victorian architecture. The architect, Charles Cummings, was a recent Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute graduate, whom the trustees perhaps chose because he was a devout Old Light Congregationalist, or because a man that young would work cheap, or perhaps both. The Academy received few significant donations in the mid-1800s, so it had to incur a heavy debt to construct the new building. This would hobble further renovation of plant and equipment for a generation to come. Tight funding may perhaps have prompted the builders to cut some corners as well, since the building was declared unsafe less than 40 years later and eventually had to be torn down. Oops, got ahead of myself there. There we go. Despite the new classroom building, seen here from School Street, Uncle Sam's last few years at the helm of PA were increasingly troubled. More and more colleges were instituting entrance examinations, although Taylor's recommendation still sufficed at Yale. In 1867, not long before graduation, he expelled 4 seniors for cutting class. 24 of the 42 remaining seniors ostentatiously cut class in protest, counting on strength in numbers. To their surprise, Taylor swiftly expelled every one of them, and the trustees, perhaps reluctantly, backed him up. Many of those who were expelled then took the entrance examination for Harvard, which they knew would annoy Uncle Sam, only to find that they could not pass it. Most eventually got in, but only after taking cram courses in subjects Taylor refused to teach. Wide reporting of this incident spread the word that Phillips Academy could no longer prepare students for Harvard, and by implication, for any college that demanded a more modern secondary education. Yet Uncle Sam achieved his own goal of leaving the academy much as he had found it, still dedicated to Latin, Greek, and Calvinism. In the winter of 1871, right after a blizzard, he left his residence in Double Brick House despite feeling ill, and trudged through the deep snow to teach his usual Sunday Bible class. Mounting these steps, he entered the lobby and was immediately struck dead by a heart attack. What better way for PA's last Puritan leader to complete his work in this world? Before I finish, I should briefly mention the rise of organized sports. By the 1850s, pickup games were giving way to contests between permanent teams, including class teams, although there was still no permanent playing field. Games took place in a variety of places, including this unkempt stretch of land behind the Victorian classroom building. Seen here from the front of the English Commons, it stretched all the way up to the Latin Commons on Phillip Street. In the 1860s, students began to field teams against opponents from outside the academy. Baseball was the game of choice, but there was also interest in a primitive rugby-like form of football. The teams representing PA were strictly club teams, entirely funded and run by students, with Uncle Sam's sometimes grudging acquiescence. They played mostly against local clubs and area cottages, not nearly as much as today against other schools. In 1865, the trustees graded a patch of land to accommodate PA's first regular baseball diamond, where both intramural and extramural games were played. However, as this photograph from between 1882 and 1892 clearly shows, the quality of the field would remain less than optimal throughout the 1870s and beyond. The same venue was laid out for football in season. We know the time frame of this photo because the building beyond the diamond, whose lazy outline makes it look bigger than it actually was, is the 1882 laboratory wing of what would become PA's first science building, once a much larger classroom wing was added in 1892. By the way, if you just heard a clanking, it's my mailman dumping the mail through the door. The completed science building, later named in honor of English department principal William Graves, appears in the background of this 1898 football photograph. To the left of it is the Victorian classroom building, and to its right are Double Brick House and Park House. Double Brick acquired the name Abbott House after the original house of that name was demolished, but the Double Brick name seems to have continued in use as well. The grading of the field had obviously improved greatly by this time, and a permanent roof stand for baseball games also appears behind the temporary football stands. In 1898, other schools constituted the bulk of PA's opponents, and the storied rivalry with Exeter was already 20 years old. So this would have been the 20th Andover Exeter game. The Victorian classroom building is long gone, but Graves Hall, Double Brick, and Park House are still very much in evidence in this photo Dick took in the fall. The Andover-Exeter rivalry started with a baseball game played in Exeter on May 22, 1898. PA lost that one, but won a return game at home. That fall, PA challenged Exeter to come to Andover for a football game. This seemingly forlorn, out-of-the-way JV soccer field is therefore sacred ground. For here on November 2nd, 1878, the first Andover-Exeter football game was played. I'm pleased to report that we won. Terry and I are now going to cover as many questions as time permits. However, feel free to email any questions we won't get to me. My email is jjpatrick3@yahoo.com. That's jjpatrick3@yahoo.com.
Okay. Sorry, I lost you all for a second, but I'm back. We've got a few questions lined up, and I'm going to get to them in a minute. But John, I want to begin by thanking you, because that's fascinating, and I love the addition of Dick Howe's images. I thought that brought a lot to the table too. It really helped to be able to compare and contrast where the old images are in relation to what's there now. You know, one of the things that I have to wonder about, and I guess it's because, you know, we're so aware of the Black Lives Matters movement and just the racial inequality in this country. Was slavery an issue that was ever addressed on campus or had any impact on campus? Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, actually, I fortunately anticipated that question, just as you say, because the subject is so much in the news and so much in everyone's thoughts at this point. There was an incident in 1835 called the Anti-Slavery Rebellion, and I wrote up a couple paragraphs on that, which might be interesting to hear. By the 1830s, a very small but growing number of Northerners had rejected previous schemes for eliminating slavery in America gradually and were calling for immediate total abolition. In 1834, William Lloyd Garrison, the most prominent leader of this polarizing movement, brought Britain's great anti-slavery orator, George Thompson, to America to address abolitionist meetings, which were often attacked by anti-abolitionist rioters. The faculty of the Andover Theological Seminary responded to such agitation, interestingly enough, by forbidding both seminary students and by extension Phillips Academy students to join any anti-slavery society on the grounds that it would distract them from their proper studies. One source states that they also feared damage to the seminary's reputation and its ability to attract Southern students. In the summer of 1835, Garrison and Thompson challenged Andover's conservative Congregationalists specifically by asking to hold a series of anti-slavery meetings either in the seminary's chapel or at South Church, the Congregational church in town. The Congregationalists refused, but the town's Methodist church agreed to host the event, only to suffer damage when angry rioters stormed into one of the evening meetings and attempted to kidnap Thompson. I'm pleased to say that PA boys were attending the meeting, and they were among those defending Thompson and preventing him from being kidnapped. Many seminarians and PA students attended these meetings despite a public warning from an eminent seminary professor that they did so, quote, at the peril of your souls, unquote. The seminary chose to overlook their participation, however, but the academy's principal was soon obliged to expel a student for a fiery anti-slavery speech at a regular Wednesday afternoon speaking contest. In protest, PA students founded an abolitionist society a few days later and petitioned the principal for recognition. So they were definitely going to make an issue of this. When he refused, 88 of them signed a written remonstrance to the principal. He was obviously trying to avoid confrontation, so he ignored it. But some 50 students then asked in writing to leave the academy honorably, in other words, with a good reference, which of course would be important for getting into college later on. When the principal equivocated, however, over 40 of them submitted their written resignations. So they felt very strongly about this. This was an extraordinarily polarizing issue, obviously, because it eventually led to the Civil War. Only 2 or 3 of the people who resigned, the kids who resigned, ever returned. However, if anyone wishes to learn more about what the devout Protestants on both sides of this incident were thinking, I recommend an online lecture by Alex Ryrie, a professor of history of the history of Christianity at Britain's Durham University. The talk is entitled "How We Learned That Slavery is Wrong," and I'll be happy to send the link to anyone who writes me at jjpatrick3@yahoo.com. So that's what I wrote up. It is interesting, as with so many other institutions, PA's record is mixed. There were people on both sides of the slavery issue, and there were people who simply wished it would go away. And I suspect they were actually the majority.
We actually have a flood of questions that have come in, and I will take them in order, and we'll see how far we get. John Mayock, class of 84, and again, I'm guessing that's 1984 and not 1884.
Not unless it's done with a Ouija board.
Asks, is it accurate to characterize Thomas Cochran as the single most transformative figure in the Academy's history? Isn't it his generosity and his vision that made PA a preeminent institution?
Well, it gets a little bit ahead of where I am because I'm going to cover Cochran and his incredible generosity, transformative generosity, in the next of these talks. The answer to the question of whether he was the most transformative, the most important, is tricky. The answer, of course, is, as often with historical questions, yes and no. He was, in terms of the physical plant, unquestionably. There's no question about it. We owe today's campus to his generosity, and it is incredibly beautiful. In terms of the nature of the school, however, there were other people who were much more important. He was basically not so much interested in the school. He already knew what it was. He approved of it, and he didn't get involved in the running of the school. The people who were running the school previously and later were responsible for the schools being what it is today as an institution.
Great answer. And I guess we'll hear more about that on March 2nd, which if you haven't put it on your calendar, do so. So Chris Dougherty asks, can you talk more about the religious differences at the time between the various colleges? And was there any difference between PA and Exeter in this regard along the way?
That's an excellent question. Unfortunately, I haven't read any history of Exeter. There are 2 histories on Exeter that I know of, and I really need to do that. But I had the good fortune, perhaps 15 years ago, when I first got interested in this sort of thing, to have an opportunity to talk with PEA's chaplain. And he told me that when Harvard went Unitarian, that was just hunky-dory with Exeter. Andover objected, but Exeter did not. Consequently, when you and I, Terry, were at Andover, the chaplain was still, by tradition, a Congregationalist, always had been. In Exeter, however, the chaplain was, there were Episcopal chaplains, there were Unitarian chaplains. The chaplain I asked was a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So Exeter basically agreed with the liberalism. So the 2 schools diverged greatly at that point, and then later on converged in the late 19th century as Congregationalist theology became more liberal. And I will discuss that in the next talk. But I really do need to know more about Exeter. That's a good reminder.
We move on to Phil Huber. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Phil. If I haven't, I apologize. And Phil asks, how did early students learn of PA and where did they come from?
If you want to know where a lot of them came from, at least the sort of place, visit Old Sturbridge Village. They came from towns and hamlets all over New England. They learned of the place in part because, of course, there was a great jungle telegraph of Congregationalists out there, and New England was still heavily Congregationalist. So particularly conservative Congregationalists would often come to the academy because they knew what its theology was. But generally, it was by word of mouth, although as the 19th century wore on, there was much, much more mention of both Andover and Exeter in the national press as well. They became quite prominent. So it was a combination of things. Early on, I'd say primarily because of the congregational connection. Later on, I'd say primarily because people had read about it or knew people in Boston or increasingly New York who were associated with the academy.
We have a second question from from John Mayock, who asks, do you have any favorite anecdotes about either Founder Phillips or Principal Pearson?
Oh dear. I don't really have an anecdote. However, let me see if I can find. I do have Leffelette Pearson's report to the Board of Trustees on what it was like to teach at the Academy, which makes for interesting reading if I can find it. However, I don't seem to be coming up with it.
Well, let's move on for the moment. We'll touch base on a couple of other ones. Randy Evans. Well, first of all, let me just, Herb Ogden, one of our 65er classmates, asked to be reminded when the next online presentation will be, and that'll be March 2nd. I can answer that, but if you want to elaborate on that, John, feel free.
Well, essentially, at that point, we'll go from when the last of the old Puritan principles died, and we'll take it up essentially to the early 1930s, when the last of the transformative construction projects on campus was completed. We'll particularly focus from an institutional standpoint on the changes to the school and the people who led those changes from the 1870s to the turn of the century. By the turn of the century, the school really had been transformed, and all it required was to continue in the same direction to make it essentially a 20th century high school. And then it was after the turn of the century that the major rebuilding of the campus got going. So these were actually done at somewhat different periods. But again, I'll be talking about all of that in March.
Another classmate of ours, Randy Evans, said he was wondering if we could, or if you could, I should say, cover again the issue of when the curriculum was broadened so that Andover graduates could pass the entrance exam to Harvard and other colleges.
With that one, I'll also say stay tuned for March, because that's when I will discuss it. I can tell you that the curriculum as late as the early 1870s was still Latin, Greek, and a little bit of math, and that was it. There was no science, no history, no nothing.
Adrian Kalmquist, and again, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly, Adrian, wonders when the Andover Seminary separated from the academy.
That will also be discussed in March. I'm writing that particular presentation up now, and I will have to remember to mention that there was a heresy trial, among other things, at the seminary. Not to worry, they were only talking about firing people, not burning them at the stake. But the seminary basically fell on hard times because people were no longer interested in the religion of John Calvin. So it eventually sort of dried up and decided the best thing to do was to try to merge with the Harvard Theology School. That then fell through, and it merged with a Baptist school to become Andover Newton Seminary. Because it was falling on such hard times, it really couldn't afford to maintain its campus. And so it sold out to the academy. But again, I'll cover all of that in March.
And then Paul, and again, if I'm pronouncing this wrong, I apologize, Paul Vrana, wonders if we could hear more about the history of quote unquote secret societies at PA.
Yeah, I can give you the broad outlines of it. They were formed starting in the mid-19th century, emulating the secret societies at Yale. Of course, because of theological reasons, Exeter was close to Harvard and we were close to Yale. They at first were regarded with great suspicion by the faculty and by the principal. And there were actually even attempts to suppress them. But eventually it was decided that, well, they were fairly harmless, so they were regularized. And eventually faculty members were sort of put in charge as their mentors, and what they could do on campus, when they could hold their meetings and so on, were all regularized by rule. However, of course, the great problem was that they really weren't the sort of place that PA, which was founded essentially as a very egalitarian institution, despite Samuel Phillips' early plan, it really wasn't they didn't contribute to the sort of environment that Andover really had always been, and that many people thought it should continue to be. There was an attempt in the 1930s or 1940s to get rid of them, but there were alums, of course, by that time who had been members and very much fought that. However, in the 50s, John Kemper, the incoming new headmaster, our headmaster, of course, was determined to get rid of them for precisely the reasons I stated. So he was able to get the Board of Trustees and enough alums behind that to abolish the secret societies. However, there are still many little buildings around campus. The building where Alumni Affairs is now located is a charming little Georgian building that was built for them. Cooley House is another example of one of their clubhouses. They did not lack for money. Alumni House, which is quite splendid, was another example. So there are still remnants of their existence around campus, but I would tend to agree with John Kemper that abolishing them from PA's standpoint as an institution was really the right thing to do.
Well, I think you've answered the final question. Oh, I take that back. They're popping up as soon as soon as you come from one to the other. So Lisa Park asks, are there street maps showing the old versions of campus?
There are a set of historic maps. I didn't use them because since they only show partial bits of what's there and things that are no longer there, they can be quite confusing. They're wonderful to look at as old documents. The archive, oh, by the way, I should mention that the archive was of a tremendous help to me. Paige Roberts is a wonderful archivist and she's very helpful to people. And the PA archive is a tremendous resource. We're so lucky to have it. But in any case, so yes, there are old maps showing where everything is. But they were just not useful for me to use in this particular talk. I actually did use one of them in a run through and that Terry was kind enough to help out with. And Terry pointed out that it was hard even to see the cursor on the old sort of worn background of the map.
My follow-up question to that is, would it be possible to get a copy of those maps from the archivist? Does the school have the ability to make that kind of a copy? I know the Boston Public Library, for example, you can get copies of old maps from them. Do you have any idea?
Well, of course, Paige is a one-man band, so she only has a limited amount of time. The archives are slowly being digitalized, but that's a very incomplete process. Paige was kind enough to let me sit down for a number of days there, and I would identify things in the archive, including 3 old maps. And she then was very kindly agreed to make copies of those for me for this presentation. However, it's not, the maps aren't readily available that I know of. I'd be happy to send the 3 that I have, which are all from the 19th century, to anybody who emails me at jjpatrick3@yahoo.com.
We've got a question, and it's from Alexandra, who is P24. Now, she could be Alexandra P of the class of 24. She could be Alexandra parent with somebody in the class of 24. Or it could be something else, I guess. But she wants to know, how was it decided back then what the cost of tuition should be? How much it was and how often was it paid? So tuition question, I could be a parent. It could easily be a parent.
I'll bet it is a parent. It sounds like it. There was always, PA always tried to keep the tuition as low as they could manage, given their costs. And they did have some money from other sources that varied, of course, over time. In the mid 19th century, that was definitely drying up. But they did try in various ways to help students who could not afford to go there otherwise. But I don't have anything to say specifically about the amounts involved. And of course, that varied greatly because, at one period, gold was $20 an ounce. So it's a little bit hard to say. It was never a cheap place to go simply because providing the quality of education that it provided was never cheap, even in the time of penurious assistants working for the principal. But PA did try to keep it as low as possible.
Well, I think on that note, John, we've reached the end of this session. We've gotten a number of comments of people who said they've enjoyed it and are planning to attend the next one. So on behalf of them and behalf of...
Terry, let me interrupt briefly. Before you leave, I want to note that one of the reasons I dressed up for this is that the suit coat that I'm wearing was the suit coat that I wore when you and I were at PA. So you can say I'm giving this presentation in costume.
Well, somebody has already said you look very sharp.
Thank you.
And we have one more comment. It's not a question, but one of our classmates had noted that for us in 1965, full tuition was $1,800 and full cost was $3,600.
Yes, my father was an automobile mechanic. Actually, he had just left that and was working as a clerk because he had a bad back. My mother was a school teacher in the Methuen Public Schools, and they could actually afford to send me to PA. Those days, unfortunately, are long gone.